that the Russians have grabbed onto very tightly. And now that Ukraine is making a reasonable go at being independent and maybe even doing well in the war, the Russians feel they have to destroy all of that.
It's another explosion.
So the civilian infrastructure obliteration strategy that the Russians started about 6 weeks ago is continuing. We know that what happened in Bucha with the atrocities there have been replicated in at least 70 places and other places that the Russians occupy. They're in the process of doing that in Mariupol right now. The infrastructure is going to go, because if the infrastructure goes, then a modern industrialized society can't exist. And ultimately, that is like a secondary goal for the Russians compared to the security stuff. But it's very, very much front of mind.
Оце народ, що ви всі понімали, оце, блядь, центр імітаційного моделювання, блядь. Оце, блядь, пизда, сука. Блядь, ще люди, нахуй, сука, впали, блядь.
Today I wanted to talk about Ukraine from an economic point of view. Now, all the strategic issue that has been in most of my updates stands. The Russians still need to plug those geographic gateways that allow access to their territory, so they still need to get all of Ukraine and then continue on. And the Russian population is still dying out, and this is their last chance to do so. All of that's true, all of that stands. But there's an economic issue underlying it that is worth exploring, because it means that the Russians are going to be a little bit more brutal than they would otherwise need to be. Ukraine, in many ways, is like the American Midwest. It has a big river going through its most productive territory. So in the United States, that's the Mississippi, allows for all of the grain and soy producing states to export their stuff at low cost out to New Orleans. In Ukraine, it's the Dnieper. Serves the same purpose. Everything goes down the river and is ultimately repackaged at Odessa for shipment to the wider world. That means that from an American economic point of view, Ukraine makes sense. For Russia, though, it doesn't work that way. I've got this weird thing, a hair right here. For Russia, it doesn't work that way. Russia only has one river that flows south. That is the Volga, and it dead ends in the Caspian Sea, which is a landlocked lake. The north-flowing rivers, the Ob, for example, have a different problem. One, they flow to the Arctic, and no one lives there, so any sort of shipment is very roundabout. Two, in winter, the rivers flow from the mouth to the source rather than the other way around. And when your river is flowing into ice, it breaks up the ice, it pushes the ice ahead of it until there's too much ice, and then the ice gets, by its mere weight, gets pushed down to the river bed, and it forms an ice dam. Ice dams can last a long time, and you get massive floods as the river overflows its banks. And it does this in Russia every fall moving into winter, all winter long, and then especially in the spring melt, because then it melts from the source to the mouth instead of the other way around, and the water has nowhere to go. So most of the floodplains in most of the world are used for agriculture. In Russia, not necessarily, because it's a death trap. There's actually a bit of a competition among the folks in the Russian military about who gets to go out and use 500-pound bombs on the ice dams to try to free up the rivers. Now, what this means in the terms of the Russian Empire, and you do need to think of Russia as an empire, it expands until it hits those gateways, and all the countries that it expands through are occupied peoples. That's an empire. That's not a republic. That's not a democracy. It means that Russia knows that its internal distribution is crap, and Russia knows it can't sell any excess production to the wider world because it's hard to get it out. But Ukraine can. Ukraine is the most productive land in the Russian sphere of influence. They have huge agricultural surpluses, a fair number of metals, some coal, other chemicals, and it can all get out easily. And once it's to the Black Sea, it can go to Turkey or through the Turkish Straits to Europe and the wider world. For Russia, it's never been that easy. So Ukraine has always been a territory that the Russians have grabbed onto very tightly. And now that Ukraine is making a reasonable go at being independent and maybe even doing well in the war, the Russians feel they have to destroy all of that.
Once Mariupol falls, regular troops from Russia, not part of the 200,000 that we pre-positioned, but regular Russian troops will start flowing through that southern coastal approach past Mariupol to Crimea. They'll take out Mykolaiv and eventually take Odessa. Now, Odessa is the commercial capital. It is the single largest wheat loading facility in the world. And once Odessa falls, the Ukrainians will have lost all maritime frontage, and it will be much more difficult for them to bring in the drones from Turkey that they've kind of fallen in love with because they work so well. Now, I don't think it's likely that Russia is going to complete the subjugation of Ukraine until at least late summer. And even then, we just have the start of what will be a multi-year, extensive partisan resistance. Most estimates, and granted, most estimates were probably put together in the first day of the war, not really realizing how bad this was going to be. But most estimates out, either from the FAO internationally or for US Department of Agriculture domestically, are only estimating a 20% or 30% reduction in Ukraine's output as opposed to last year. That's wildly over-optimistic. Exports are not simply going to go to zero. Ukraine will become a net importer this year. A few reasons for that. Number one, Russia is deliberately destroying any towns it can. The goal for here is so that any future guerrilla support infrastructure is preemptively wrecked. It's smart, I guess, from a certain point of view, but it also destroys all of the support infrastructure for agriculture. Second, Ukraine never really had a big industrial base. Most of their output is in large scale dependent upon imported inputs: capital, seeds, machinery, fertilizer. None of that can make it in. The Ukrainians are not going to plant this year. And those two factors are more than enough to ensure that Ukraine is not just going to not plant this year, but also next year. They may be able to harvest some of their winter wheat when it is ready in June and July, but none of that will be for export. This is going to be the beginning of a 1980s style Ethiopia famine in what used to be one of the world's largest food exporter. And then third, of course, Odessa is going to fall under Russian control. And if the Russians treat Odessa anything like they have treated every other population center they've come across, it's going to be shelled, and most of the port infrastructure will probably be destroyed. The road and rail infrastructure in and out of the city certainly will be destroyed. This is the first war the world has had since World War II that has occurred in a breadbasket. We do not have a modern experience for this. And unlike in previous wars, whether it's been in the former Yugoslavia, in Africa, wherever it's happened to be, Ukraine and the rest of the world has enjoyed 75 years of peace and industrialization and population expansion. Ukraine's population in 1900 was only about 25 million. At the post-Soviet collapse, they were up to 50. They've had some out-migration and some bad demographic news. They're about 45 million now. So we're breaking down local food production here in Ukraine, and they're going to end imports and exports to a degree that we even haven't seen yet. We're going to have a 19th century style famine in a country with a 21st century population. You toss that all together, and it's not simply that Ukraine is vanishing from global agricultural markets this year. And it's not simply that Ukraine is going from a massive food exporter to a sizable food importer. Ukraine is going to be a sizable food importer until such time that the Russian system, not the Russian government, the Russian system collapses. They will not come back to markets until that occurs. And that is unlikely to be this decade.